Would you talk about this sense of inevitability? I think that's a fascinating concept, and it's clearly important to you.
Hmm. Um, well, I think, in traditional, the what we call the common practice period, the harmony gave the sense of inevitability, the sense of cadence, the sense of when you know the piece is over, or when you know the piece is developing, and then you know when it's over. And that worked for a good long time, a good 300 years or so. But before that was a lot of really interesting counterpoint that didn't have that exactly. And since then, of course, there's been every possible kind of experiment and technique possible for composition, which is so exciting. And as with visual art, I mean, the 20th century was just this incredible blossoming of so many different ways of looking at the same things, and that I just love, delving into that always. Um, and it's continuing now. I mean, different pressures, but it's since the early 20th century that we have this kind of individualization of artistic endeavor, where there's a freedom to have one's own voice in a way that's really not like anything that came before. Um, so the thing about new musical languages and new musical styles since the early 20th century is that all the best composers find their own way of pulling the listener through a piece without relying on the old, 251 or 451. So, um, and there are lots and lots of ways of doing that. So you can do it through density and timbre. You can do it through rhythm. You can do it, you can have kind of oblique senses of tonal movement without having the old trappings. Um, there's so many different and interesting ways that composers have worked with these kinds of ideas. Um, and it's about working with time and having a sense of time, and that you can see as a kind of storytelling. You can see it as a kind of architecture, or maybe poetry reading, or it's but having control over time and how a piece evolves through time is really interesting, and I think a big part of what composers do. um, so for me, some of that has to do with rhythm and kind of the acceleration and slowing down and kind of layering of rhythm and syncopation and the sense of kind of physical movement and dance, but then also stillness. And some of it has to do with a sense of tonality that isn't tonality, a sort of bass movement or pedal tones, or something that gives that kind of visceral feeling that we get from cadences. One of the most, the beautiful things about harmony and making us feel that things resolve. I think there are more modern ways of doing that without referring to the old styles. Um, I think about those things a lot. I don't know, and I try to solve those problems differently from piece to piece too. Because I think, and that's back to what you asked me about with time and relationships with older pieces and older work and older periods, is that you know when you're creating, you never rest. Every new piece is kind of thinking about the old piece or going somewhere different that the old piece didn't go to. Just playing with the same materials or using the tools in a different way time after time after time. And that's to keep it interesting. It gets really boring if you write the same piece over and over again. And sure, there are some composers and colleagues who do that actually, but for me, I just love challenging what I've done and what I'm going to do next. And some of that is just the joy of being a concert composer and being able to go from orchestra to solo piano to string quartet to song cycle to opera scene to brass quintet. The switches of genres and different musicians that I've been able to write for really keeps the challenges interesting and fresh and challenging. Yeah.
Well, are you like Mahler in your eyes creating a larger piece through your pieces? Is there a sense of inevitability that you're working towards as a composer?
Maybe. At least I don't have to write just in the summertime like Muller did. Though I do have my day job too as a professor.
Right.
Um, Yeah, I think I certainly one thing I like to talk about is sourdough. So taking a pinch of something from an old piece and putting it in a new piece is my sort of sourdough starter idea. And I do have a lot of pieces that cross cross reference little, almost imperceptible things. Or if someone wants to do a PhD someday to analyze all of that, they certainly could. Um, and it's a kind of internal dialogue, with older pieces and newer pieces and different things that kind of come back from piece to piece. But I think some of that working came out of just getting to know other composers, historical composers work really well and hearing, certain kinds of progressions over and over again in my favorite parts of Mozart, or the same kinds of gestures in Ravel over and over, that they have many, many great composers have this kind of fingerprint that goes from piece to piece to piece. So sometimes I do that really consciously, and sometimes it's just unconscious, and it just happens. But I think the longer you write, the more you create, the more you start to see the interconnections between the things that you're making. And why not embrace that? Sometimes it does really make it easier, to have a piece in dialogue with an older piece, for example.
Well, one way I can think of that's an easy way to think about inevitability is in the game theory stuff that you have, because games have an inevitable conclusion. And one piece in particular I'd like to talk about is Truel, which really caught my eye when I first discovered you'd written it. It was like, Truel, what a cool idea, three-way battle. And I thought you created it, but you didn't create this idea. Truel was first written up by a guy named Martin Shubik in his 1964 book Game Theory. And it's even included in such films as Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, one of my favorite films. There's a Truel, and I never even thought about that. Wow. So talk about games and Truels and things like that.
Yeah, so the game theory idea, particularly with the Troll, but a couple of other pieces, kind of connected very much with the military strategy and Sun Tzu in terms of setting up a situation of conflict. Um, so, and to me, that was kind of a perfect reflection of this sort of chamber music experience where you see these small ensembles in dialogue with each other and answering each other and maybe cutting each other off, sort of it's such a wonderful drama to attend a live performance and see how, you know, ensembles really can interact, especially quartets and trios, like when it's more intimate like that. Um, so yeah, it was the book Fermat's Last Theorem that came out, I guess, in the early 2000s. That discussed about a lot of different sort of mathematical game theory ideas, and it described the troll. And what I loved about the troll too is that it's a setup of three combatants, and since they can't shoot each other at the same time, the agreement is that they take turns shooting. And so, and this is where it becomes a numbers game. So you have one combatant who always hits their target, the other combatant hits it half the time, and then the last poor sap misses all the time. So I had the idea that this could play out rhythmically in terms of speeds. So having a piano trio where the violin goes twice as fast as the cello, which goes twice as fast as the piano. But it was also a kind of humorous homage to my piano playing days of always missing really technical hard things that I was learning to play, like getting cracks on octave, passages and things. So I had a lot of fun writing a piano part that always seems to miss. And it has all sorts of grace notes sort of going the wrong way and things like that. So so that was the game of peace. But I also loved the Truel puzzle because it's a little war game where actually the pacifist prevails because the solution to the troll is that the poor combatant who always misses just should shoot in the air and let the other two duke it out. So in a way, by being the worst shot, they had the best chances of surviving. And so that gave a little narrative to my piece in terms of the piano having the last word as well. So it was really a delightful combination of things mathematical and rhythmic and proportional, as well as having this sort of hinted narrative of kind of war and then peace prevailing. Um, so that's the general idea of the Truel. So that was my first piano trio. And the piece was commissioned as a single movement, but then a choreographer got interested in it, and I was commissioned to write two further movements. So the piece became a kind of game of threes, three movements, and everything in a triple meter. But then sort of developing out of that with these proportions and rhythmic setups that have a kind of combat and pacifist sort of. Anyway, so it's a big piece, and yeah, I really enjoyed kind of merging the structural with a sense of narrative and that.
Well, from there, you got more and more interested in nature. And it occurs to me that nature is a refinement and an expansion of game theory in that it's not limited to theory. It's like game theory put into practice with birds attacking birds and insects doing their thing in the world. Can you talk about how you moved to nature? And was it just a natural progression, or was there something more concrete that led you to nature?
Well, it was really with the Darwin piece, Game of Attrition, that I really started to think about these things because I approached it from a strategic angle, but it then was, of course, so intimately tied with what we understand of the natural world. That and I started to really read and reflect more and more that our understanding of nature is so far away from what composers from earlier periods thought about when they were writing nature pieces, and this is what really got me excited about using ideas from nature, a sense of process, thought, bird song, animal behavior, things like this in my composition. Because of course we know so much more now about why birds sing. They're not singing pretty songs for us when we take a walk by the brook like for Beethoven. And I mean, of course, the romantics were romantic about nature because they were seeing the first industrial, developments in their time. So they were reacting too to modernity in a certain way. But of course, now we know so much more about the inevitability and brutality and the sort of pitiless side of nature. And then also with birds being particularly fascinating, I mean, it really wasn't clear even when I was, in my school days that birds were really dinosaurs, like this is something that really has only been very plain, to science and to science reporting for the last, what, 20 years maybe? So, really to think about these beautiful little musical creatures being dinosaurs, and if you scale them up they're really pretty terrifying if you think about it. And but then also these are animals that make music, and there is or something akin to music that I can use in my compositions in a kind of uh, constructed way, while thinking about these ideas of process and of nature not being about us at all, and trying to continue its way without all the things that our species is doing to it. So many layers of things to think about as a composer and as an artist and as a human. It's one of the richest subjects we can really go into.
Maybe not about us specifically in terms of the birds aren't fighting about us, but what the birds are doing is definitely related to us because even though we hide our natural tendencies with technology and with stories and with the internet and advertising, the deepest level, we're still acting like these birds, you say, and maybe your music gives us a chance to take an honest look at that aspect of ourselves.
Maybe so, yeah. I mean, you know, Well, the birds are better than us, aren't they? I mean, they're just trying to survive. They're not ruining it for all the other species. So they're way better than we are, actually. Um, but but yeah, I think I really feel that artistically, reflecting on nature in a way that doesn't sentimentalize it is particularly interesting for our time and maybe more honest. And it doesn't mean that there isn't beauty. I mean, the same way that the birds are beautiful. They are not trying to be beautiful. They just are. And I think that you can create work that has beauty without being pretty. That there's a kind of monumentality or sort of sense of accumulation that can be very powerful without mollifying and prettifying. Um, and that's part of what I mean too about taking on natural themes and ideas while being more honest about it.
This may be me reading too much into you, and I'm apologizing ahead of time if I do, and you can call me out. But it occurs to me that when I think about birds and getting down to the tiniest little, this is my tiny little patch, and I'm a seed eater, and I'm competing with the people that eat my seeds. For me, this is such an analogy to composers.
Yeah.
And especially women composers, right? Like I'm carving out a niche here. Get out of my niche. Do you is that a coincidence or is there some of that going on?
Well, I think as Nadia Boulanger said, I'm not astonished at being a woman. It's all I got, and this life is what I was handed. So I don't think I'm thinking about being a woman composer when I'm composing. Um, but absolutely, composer world is about as niche as you get. And the slightly crazy endeavor of writing new work for the old museum of the classical music establishment is, a brave and insane thing to do. And I think the only reason why I was crazy enough to want to do it is because I saw people who were doing it. I mean, and yeah, most of them were men, but I just thought, they can do this, I can do this, and it is what I wanted to do. Um, but yeah, I mean, life in the art world is of any of the arts is certainly about survival and fighting for one's patch, however small. There's certainly a brutally Darwinian side to life in the arts. There's no question.
You have said you've mentioned that you're interested in the natural progression about little details leading to big global changes. And to some extent, composers, are writing for a tiny little subset of the population. And even a smaller subset are going to understand and appreciate what they're doing. And yet, there is the hope that what you're doing matters. Or at least to me, there's the hope. Do you share that hope that even though you're writing these pieces that are very specific and may only be heard by a few thousand people if you're lucky, that it could make a difference in the world?
Well, I think any artist wants to make things well for the joy of making, but also to add something, to give something to the world. And it doesn't matter how big or small that public is. I mean, poor Vincent van Gogh had no idea that anybody would care about his paintings whatsoever. It's sort of I mean, certainly a lot of composers who labored in obscurity and were only appreciated after their death. I'm taking my kid to see Carmen as his first opera in a few weeks. Poor Bizet had no idea what that piece would do in the world. And all that glorious music, how it affects so many, you know. But what I'm sure of is that, you know, all great artists, whether they're appreciated in their time or not, they had real joy when they were making art. It's so having a life in the arts is the day to day of making, and I think that is the make or break for anyone who really wants to do it. If you enjoy actually making stuff, then this is the life for you, you know, and you can't give it up. You get addicted to it. You just want to keep making and making more. And sure, you want it to be appreciated, but you have no control whatsoever over any of that. And then also, you know, even for composers, you know, past and present who've been wildly successful, maybe it was the piece that they really hated that becomes popular, and all the stuff they thought was their best work gets ignored. You know, um, I mean,
Rachmaninoff.
well, you have no control over these things. Um, so so if you don't have the joy of, you know, making, then there's no point. You can't. You have to focus on that, the daily life of it, and not what's going to happen to pieces. I mean, I certainly, you know, with the whatever minuscule niche success various pieces of mine have had, I couldn't tell you why one piece gets played a lot more than another. You know, I put everything I could into all my pieces, so you know, you just can't know. But you also can't worry about it. Not if you're going to enjoy the day to day of it.
This is really wonderful. A lot of wisdom here, and I hope the people who are interested in composing are hearing you. Are your students receptive to these things that you tell them about composing, or do they resist you?
You can only try. I don't know. I mean, you know, some of the great things my teacher said to me, I didn't really get what they said for another decade after. You know, it's also where you're at as a student, how receptive you are to what you're told, and um, but no, I mean, I think what I really care about in terms of students and teaching is just helping my students write the music they want. You know, I couldn't be more mortified than with the idea of having a mini me as a student. You know, I can't stand the kind of egoistic teaching that has been a tradition in my field and many others for a long time. And thank God, I mean, the best teachers I had were never like that. And I think, you know, the responsibility of teaching, if you're going to do it well, is to help your students find what they want and help them do what they're doing as best they can. Um, and you can only try, you know, and you don't know what life is going to deal to them either. You know, it's in terms of the Darwinian world of the arts, you know, um, but to try to, you know, listen and advise generously and constructively, you know, that's the duty of care that I take very seriously.
Well, I wish you had been my composition teacher. It's really been a pleasure to talk to you, and thank you for taking the time.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
And thank you, audience, as always, for joining us. We hope you have enjoyed this interview, and we hope you'll enjoy some of the other interviews on the channel. Please like us if you like what you see, and please subscribe to see more. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time.